Yo, okay. I had to use the bathroom during the first part of the. Oh my God, this game volume is. Hurry up earlier. Just doing random stuff. Should I keep the stream going?
Because she's a specialist, while my father tends to get home around 8 to 9. Since this was 7 p.m., I said, "Hi, Dad," while playing. I paused the game and looked up to say I was
Let's
sorry
go.
I
I'm
was
gonna
in
get
their
all my
room without their
keys.
permission.
The
When I
keys,
saw it,
keys,
my jaw
keys.
dropped and I couldn't speak. That's not my father. Let me paint the scenario for you a little. Dark room with no overhead lights, a slight bluish glow coming from the TV, and the only
So I was
source
just
of
in the
light other
bathroom
than that was
during
the light coming
mission.
from
I
the
was
outside
trying to
hallway.
play
So,
Twitch,
two
but I
sources of
realized I didn't have
light,
Twitch
one from the
downloaded.
TV and one weak overhead from the
Else,
outside
else.
room. What I saw was massive, definitely taller than my father, who is 6'2". From the position it was in, what had happened was, the creature had somehow gotten to the hallway outside my parents' room, opened the door, and
When you
peered
don't
in.
realize that
Now
you're
remember, there
since
was
you're
the
not
light
in
in
a
the
party,
hallway.
you're in
This
game
creature
chat
was
and you're
so big,
just
it blocked out the
saying a
overhead
random
light.
story about
Now,
how
all the light
you're
source
taking a
in my
poop
parents' room came from the
the game chat,
TV
and everybody's
and its
just like,
eyes. It had red glowing eyes, almost perfectly circular. Its eyes were on the front of
they
its
totally thought
face
I was
like
talking to them,
humans.
but
It had no
did I just
pupils,
tell you
no
random stories like
eyelids,
that?
no corneas or irises. Just two red eyes that swirled inside like a vortex. Its fingers were holding to the doorknob. I don't know if the doorknobs are metal or silver or some other element, but it was fine with the physical contact. I have spent a lot of time looking at fingernails since growing up, and I can definitely say it had no fingernails. Its fingers were just pointed into sharp tips. I could see the edges holding
Okay,
on the doorknob. It was using its right side arm from the angle, but because of the darkness, I could only see its fingers on the doorknob without being able to see how big its arm was. Now the darkness, pitch black. My parents have very heavy curtains, so
really
without the
scary to
overhead
be
light,
hidden though.
it's quite hard to make out anything. But the blue light from the TV was on, and I still couldn't see anything beyond its claws and eyes. And as for the head, this is why I'm making such a big deal about the pitch darkness and the number of lights. There was no end to its head, it just kept going. I couldn't see a skull or hairline.
An
I couldn't
endless,
see
oh no
horns, and the
hairline,
creature was
bro.
standing outside the hall,
You need to
leaning
take to
inside my parents' room.
barber.
If I could see its eyes, then surely I must have been able to see the top of its head, right? But no. Even as a kid, I remember staring dumbstruck at it, and my only thought was, where's the ending to its head? It just kept going. Then, after those few seconds where we were
Look
just
at the
staring at
top
each
of
other,
this.
the TV exploded. There is a lining between the TV and the back, which technicians can remove to get to the circuits, and I heard a zapping kind of sound and blue sparks exploded out the back of the TV,
Blue
and the picture
sparks?
shut off.
I've never seen
I
blue
jumped and
sparks
turned my
before.
head to look when the TV exploded, and in that second the creature slammed the door, the hardest slam I have ever heard till now, and I was alone. After a moment, I recovered a bit and yelled, "Hey!" and ran to the door to chase after the monster. But when I opened my parents' door, the
Hey,
hallway was totally deserted. I ran
you're really gonna
downstairs
see a
yelling,
monster and
"Dad!"
say hey?
thinking he had something to do with this. When I got downstairs, my sister was in the living
What
room,
would
and
you
I
say
asked
if
her
you
where
seen a
Dad
monster though?
was. She said, "He's not home yet. You know it's too early." And sure enough, there was
I
no
wouldn't know
car in
what
the
to say and all
driveway.
that.
I asked my sister if she heard a loud door slam, and she said no. I went back upstairs to look, but
Oh, that
it
that
wasn't
just
anywhere in
proves
the
a lot even
house.
more.
I was almost ready to believe. I imagined the whole thing. But when I tried to turn the TV on again, it wouldn't work. My parents assumed a bulb must have busted and got a bigger TV.
Start this.
I never dared to mention why the TV suddenly broke. So that's my story. Ever since, I've been just waiting to see
Promise I'm
another
gonna do
demon,
more damage.
but not even on the internet can I find something that correlates very much. I don't know if its skin was pure black or if it was just blocking out the light, or if it caused that level of pitch darkness, but all I could see were those eyes.
Let's write a song. Hey, I'm Hurt, and welcome.
I'm a 32-year-old man, yet it is broad daylight as I write this post because what I'm about to share haunts me to this day. To the point that merely thinking about this memory is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only told this story to a handful of people over the past 10 years because of how terrifying of an experience it was for me. But I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share with others. Maybe others have had a similar experience. To tell this story and give it justice, I have to tell of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter this post is about. My name is Joshua, but I will change names to protect the privacy of others involved in this story. I live in Arkansas, and in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf with my friend, we'll call him Bob. Wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980-something white Celebrity. It was really a piece of crap vehicle.
Are we on Z-Hits?
It was becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car, and he took us around the area. First to an old abandoned house, but other than some raccoons rustling around, it was a 2-hour waste of time. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted, but again a bust. Then an old church that was run down and supposed to be haunted, once again, yawn. At this point, it was getting close to midnight and my wife and I were getting pretty bored, and I spoke up to Bob saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." Then that's when Bob smiled, saying he was saving the best for last. He handed me a Polaroid picture of a hillside covered in trees in daylight. I asked him what it was. He asked me if I saw the house or any type of lighting pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied no. He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there is no power lines either. During this time, he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. Then after that, it was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other, with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night, except the moon above our heads and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us all to get out. We did what he asked. He walked us to the other side of the car where the wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone, which had no signal. This was 2003 and the area had no cell towers. But he looked at his phone and said it was 11:57 p.m. and told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even at night, I could tell it was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then at exactly midnight, a small light flickers on. A deep chill runs down my back as we all watch this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, swaying back and forth. We sat and watched it in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes. When I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this, Bob said he did not know, but the locals told him that every night at 12 a.m., this lantern will light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was.
This man really kicked
At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything could scare or hurt me. So since there was no houses around, I yelled out, "We see you! Wow, you're so scary with your little lantern." Bob shushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but I stopped as I looked to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth, but moving down the hillside to the field at a frightening pace. It began to speed across the field towards our car. We didn't stick around to see what it was because within seconds, we were in the car flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back to see the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent until Bob spoke up saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed. And if we decide to go back out anywhere, it'd be best to take my truck until we could get gas in the morning, as he only had about a half a quarter tank." I said okay. A few minutes later, we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and talked about what just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time and told him she was getting hungry. He told her we brought some snacks, but she said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if he could take my truck to the next town over to get some food, because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get to that town. I agreed. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key, and nothing happened. My truck was dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. This was strange and made us all feel uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood, pulled Bob's car around to the front, and attempted to jump my truck with his car. This is where it gets even stranger. As soon as we connected the jumper cables to his battery, the cables between the connectors started to smoke, and in a flash of fire, they burnt up within seconds. The cables were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the clamps at the end still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car, and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other in the eerie moon and starlit night, and we all get a bad feeling at exactly the same time. As we suddenly realized we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was a boat motor. Now, like I said, it was the time of year when it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up, standing still, waiting.
You just said it was.
But somebody was on a boat after midnight, when it had to be ice cold with the wind hitting them. And from the sound of the motor, it was going pretty fast. But we saw nothing. That was until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the woman to get in his car and lock the doors. I reach the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another. I work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of trade in my truck. We were standing in the middle of our vehicles, with the hoods up. As the boat pulls forward to the dock, two heavily bearded men in their late 30s step out of the boat and walk up. It is hard to give an accurate description as their spotlight was still pointed at us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow while blinding Bob and I. They look at us and at our vehicles, and one glanced in the direction of the car at the women, then back at us and let out a small chuckle.
Are you going to talk to me?
"You fellers got in some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, but nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet and sees the smoking ashes of what was our jumper cable. "Looks like it was more than your weak jumper cables could handle. You all need some help? We got some tools on our boat that I think can fix you guys' problem right up." Then the other man who chuckled says, "Fix 'em right up." I'm speechless at this moment, probably with my mouth hanging open. I can't remember as the two men walk back to their boat to hear what sounded like chains rattling around. But the spotlight is so blinding we can barely see, but the chain noise was enough. Bob looked at me without saying a word. We both jumped in his car and drove the hell out of there. For the next few hours, we drove to a populated area of houses, which wasn't many in the secluded area. We were pretty much stuck, since we had very little fuel, but we all sat quiet in the car, looking around in all directions in near panic. thinking that any time those men would find us. Bob turned his lights on every now and then, thinking that he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how weird this whole ordeal had been. He laughs, saying, "I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know it would be this sort of scary." At this point, the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out. But the men never showed up, and eventually the morning was on its way. And it was about 20 minutes until sunrise. Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas, and he said, "Yeah, the local store opens up in an hour, so we'll be fine." I tell him in that case, then sure. We wake up the women and drive back to the hillside. We get there about 4 minutes left until sunrise, and we still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me and I smile and do the motion for zipping my lips. And we all watch and wonder as right at sunrise the lantern slowly fades away to nothing. After this, we get back in our car and drive to the lake, feeling safer now. When we got there, there was no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck was still up, and the doors were still locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try to start the truck one more time, before he drives us somewhere where I can't get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, this truck started right up, with no hesitation or problem. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings, and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating to others, and that we never wanted to come back to the area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I hadn't seen in almost 2 years at this point,
This man took me out of
calls
my
me
party
up and
just
says he
to
has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me that he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places, and asked me if I would be willing to film their session in a haunted place for their records, and that they would pay me well for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I've always loved the paranormal, even after what I went through at Sugarloaf. I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown. I told him yes, I would love to film for them. But I had no interest in joining in. I was okay with watching and just getting to be out there, looking into the paranormal again. So, of course my next question was when and where we're going to be doing this first. When he answered me, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wished so much that I had trusted my gut feeling and told him I changed my mind. Remember the lantern light near Sugarloaf? He asked me if there was any way I could ever forget. Yeah, I stammered. Why do you ask? Bob said. I told my group the story, and they want to do the ritual there, and see if they can contact the spirit to find out why it's there and what it wants. I don't know, man. Oh, come on, Josh. Trust me. You'll be safe, and I'm going to pay you $250 just to sit there and film it, he retorted. At the time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight, because diapers, formula, and the cost of a small fortune. Not to mention it was our first kid, so my wife had been going crazy spending money on just the necessities. I had to weigh out my fear of the area. I accepted Bob's offer. And a week later, I was in the same beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years before. This time, Bob and 3 others, that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces. It was 11:50 p.m. when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle and I was behind them, to the right about 5 feet from the barbed wire fence, which was in front of the field that led to the hillside. My back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence, and I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. As I've been typing this entire post, I've been getting knots in my stomach, knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part of the story haunts my dreams and even waking hours to this day. I'm going to do my best to describe how the following events unfolded. I know mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued, or how horribly horrific the events sounded and were. So when reading or listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up. And believe me when I say, up until this point in my life, I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out and go ghost hunting and getting myself spooked or whatever. But after this night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I show it respect and stay as far away as possible. As much as I dread it, I will now finish telling the story.
Are we
And his
hacking?
group is chanting. Bob lights up a huge candle in the middle of
Yeah, I was
them
about to
and
say.
opens some sort of book. Not like a scary antique spell book or anything. It looks like a newer hardcover. Anyways, he starts reciting words from it and then looks at his phone. He tells his group to be quiet and look at the hill. I turn the camera at midnight, on the dot,
Do that
and the
again.
lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool!" I rolled my eyes. Since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word cool didn't seem to fit in their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempted to communicate with the spirit. I turned my head back to the light and began to film the group as they chanted again. Bob reads from the book, then they start asking questions, in hopes the spirit would respond. About this time, a wind picks up and Bob's candle goes out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute. And I agree and stop recording and watch as Bob tries his lighter, then 2 lighters from the group. But none of the lighters are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing a rustling behind me. I jumped up, leaving the camera on the ground, and spun around. Bob and his group were preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I turned around, I was blinded by the brightest light I have ever seen. What I believe was the lantern, up close and personal, but as quickly as it appears, the light was gone. The lantern is nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field right behind me without me realizing it, within a span of maybe 30 seconds. I look around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It's only 12:15 a.m. and the light always stayed until sunrise. At this moment, the wind quits blowing and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick and see it light up. I mutter, guys, did you see that? They all turn and ask what I was talking about. But before I can answer them, we were all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from seemingly nowhere.
Oh.
And this is no ordinary laughter. It sounds like the laughter of hundreds, maybe even thousands of children. That haunts me to this very moment. As I type this, I am looking around the room I am in. Whenever I talk or think about this experience, I can vividly remember the sound and hear it in my head. The best way I can describe the laughter for you, imagine listening to a large group of kids singing Row Your Boat. You know how one kid will start and seconds later, another will join in, starting at the beginning of the song and so on? Well, it sounded like that. I said like hundreds or thousands of children laughing. As if one started laughing, seconds later another would. The pattern went on in an endless loop.
A decent amount of damage.
I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song Row Your Boat. I'm saying they laughed in unison, like kids do when singing Row Your Boat. One would start, then seconds later another, then another, and the laughter was getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing all around us, coming from all directions. I was shaking, I could not move. I was spinning around, looking off in the distance. This couldn't be real, this sort of thing doesn't happen. What the hell is happening? I scream at Bob and his group. We need to get the hell out of here. But they are already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candle behind. Without hesitation, I run after them and jump in the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We peeled out of there and drove about a mile up the road and pull over as Bob is in no condition to drive. We were all freaking out. We all got out, pacing around the car, asking each other if we really just heard all that. I tell Bob that I'm sorry, but I left his camera behind. He says he does not care and that he isn't going back for it. At this point, I got my hands on my knees panting, trying to catch my breath, as I have never been that terrified in my life. That is when all the chatter stops, and once again we hear the laughter off in the distance, very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder, until once again it's becoming deafening. We jumped back in the car and sped away. We drove for about 6 miles, and for the first 3 miles we could still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little bit. We all began to calm down a little by mile 4, when the laughter could no longer be heard. But we have no intention of pulling over again. Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone, waiting for the signal to pop up. And at about mile 6, Bob's friend, he finally has a signal. And he hands the phone to Bob, and he calls a friend of his, who is into the supernatural and well-versed and educated in it. As we are driving, he is describing what happened to the lady. Bob later told me that his friend told him she believed it was children of the Hecate, or something like that. I have no idea what Hecate is, but it sounded like more of a guess to me. Anyway, Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area. Me and the 2 other people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time. They later told me that the hair on the back of their neck stood up as a loud snapping noise comes from under the front end of the car, and Bob's celebrity stops dead in its tracks and will no longer move forward. He tries everything, but the car is not moving. We later discovered that the tie rod had snapped. Anyways, the friend Bob was talking to on the phone only lived 20 minutes away from where we were, and said that they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke. After about 3 minutes, we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road toward us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but Bob and I thought maybe we could get a ride from a local. We all unloaded out of the car and stood in front, waiting for the vehicle to hopefully stop. Now I cannot be certain, but my gut tells me I'm correct. The vehicle doesn't stop, but it does come into view. It is an old beat-up truck, and it slows down, and in the truck are 2 men in their late 30s with huge beards. They stare at us and sped up after passing by. I look at Bob, and before I could speak, he says what I was already thinking. The guys from the boat. Before I can say anything back, we see the headlights coming from the same direction the truck went. We stood up and stayed quiet, as the same guys in the truck passed by slowly, again staring at us. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get here now. 4 or 5 minutes go by, and we see the headlights coming. Relieved, we all get our stuff ready, thinking it's Bob's friend. Then the phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and was going to be about 10 to 15 minutes more before she gets there. Bob hangs up the phone, and we watch in terror as the same truck slowly passes by again. This time, only one of the boatmen in the truck. The driver slows down to a crawl and says, "Looks like you fellers could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact to Bob and I that we were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell did the other guy go? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse, at this point we had almost forgotten completely about due to the boatmen. We began to hear laughter again off in the distance, but all around us, like before. Over the next few minutes, it started getting closer and closer. I am almost pissing my pants as the sound is deafening and we have nowhere to run this time. And then from behind the car, off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights turn on and 2 vehicles coming toward us slowly, side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road. The laughter now seemed to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road we were stuck on, and the laughing seemed to be zeroing in on us, as if hundreds or thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There is no wind, no sound other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky road, and the 2 vehicles slowly driving toward us. With our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children, and the headlights of the two vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we are given a reprieve, as at this time, coming from the other direction, we see another set of headlights coming fast. We hold our breath, the laughter, the boatmen. What could be next? How will we get out of this? And then the vehicle that was speeding at us pulls up, and it's Bob's friend. She unlocks the doors on her car and rolls her window down and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the two sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kids." She screams at us to get in, and we do. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around. And no sooner than she starts to drive away, the two sets of headlights come on again with their brights on, and they are only about a car length behind us. I yell at the driver, "Go, go, go!" channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her, "Faster, we must go faster." She floors it, and for about 2 miles, the two vehicles stay on our trail. Then they turn off onto a side road. The next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter off in the distance with our windows down. Then 3 miles after that, the laughter was gone. To this day, I have no explanation on what happened, what the laughing children were, why the laughing followed us, if the boatmen were connected to this all somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence that happened to terrify us at the same time. And if that's the case, why did they not
I almost
react to the
did the
laughing
same thing
children
then.
sound? Is the lantern connected to the laughing children? Or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children with their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it. I have had constant chills and goosebumps while writing this. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You can think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how powerful or mundane the paranormal could be. If you use paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly sociopathic hillbillies and laughing children. I hope everyone who reads this or listens to it sleeps
Bro,
well,
he based it out
but
of
I
that
know after
so
telling
fast.
my story, the next few nights, I will be getting no sleep at all. So, to give background, at the time of this story, I was a freshman at a small Christian college in Massachusetts, when this happened on a Saturday night in the spring. On this particular Saturday, I had decided not to go out to any parties because I wasn't feeling it. So instead, I decided to hang out with a few friends and drive around and do random things. At around 12:30 a.m., some friends were getting tired and wanted to go hit the hay, so we drove them up to their dorms and dropped them off. So the only two people left were myself and a friend of mine. Before I left to go into my dorm, she said she wanted to talk to me about her liking one of my close friends, so I stayed and talked for a while. It was around 1:15 a.m. where things started to get weird.
That was my fault.
I was looking at her talking when out of my peripheral vision saw something white and small fly across the windshield, and my head snapped. Her seeing me asked what I saw, so I explained it being a white bird, to which her response was, there's no white birds here. That was when the feeling hit me.
How did you?
Have you ever felt so strongly about something internally, like
when
pure
people
joy
do that
or extreme sadness? I felt that feeling, except nothing besides pure fear. I couldn't tell you what it was from, but I sat in the passenger seat frozen with fear from something I didn't know. The girl, we will call her Becca, instantly knew something was wrong because she asked me, Connor, are you okay? To which I replied, yeah, I'm fine, to try not to freak her out. She replied with, "Stop bullshitting, your eyes are huge and you're sitting up and pale as you could be." She had me there. I looked at my arms, and my hair was standing straight on end. I tried to explain what I was feeling to no avail. Then it got worse. I literally couldn't move in my seat and started seeing shadows move, but nobody was walking around. Keep in mind, it was 2 a.m. Becca saw my eyes dart from side to side and kept asking me what I saw, to which I reply, nothing. Then, around 2:30, the thing that spooked me out the most arrived. I was being a nervous wreck when my eyes caught something down a hill near the dumpsters. It had arms and legs, but it was way too tall to be a person. Plus there was no visible feet, and it was a solid 2 feet off the ground and all black. As I stared at this thing, it moved from where I saw it to across the dumpsters and then left my sight. And the reason it left my sight, it wasn't because it was behind the building out of viewpoint. No, it just vanished. Just like that. Gone. By this time I was struggling to even take a consistent breath from the amount of terror I was feeling. Becca was trying to calm me down. Give her credit, but while I was looking at her talking to me, I kept noticing her eyes darting around to random places behind me. Every time I asked what she saw, she said nothing. Eventually, I was able to get my ass out of the car and sprint to my dorm room, but that was not until 5 a.m. I eventually fell asleep and woke up trying to convince myself it was all just because I was overtired and that I was seeing things and overreacting. Becca texted me that morning to ask if everything was okay. What she said confirmed all my fears. Now that it was daytime, she finally confessed what she saw when she was trying to calm me down. A few shadows were there, and a weird sort of evil feeling was in the air, and a weird floating thing off in the distance. Wait a minute, I said. Shadows and feelings I can deal with, but explain that floating thing you saw. She described the same exact floating thing that I saw near the dumpsters to every detail. And when she saw it after I did, it was about 20 feet from the car behind me. This had me terrified. I couldn't walk near those dumpsters for weeks, let alone walk up the hill at night. Luckily, I never saw or felt these things again. I will never know who or what really was there, but I do know I am confident that it was the devil himself trying to confront me and make me question my faith. Before then, I never really believed in ghosts or entities, but now I absolutely do. And Becca confirms it all. Whatever you were. A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It's about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests. This is definitely one of those more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way up to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus, and figured by the time that we got there, we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and the colors were amazing. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the hike, you are supposed to camp on the trail, or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people, and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore the suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A bit of searching and we found a little spot off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m. I was awoken by my girlfriend, shaking me, telling me, "Someone is outside walking around our tent." She informed me that she woke up with what sounded like someone right outside the tent, running a stick or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a judge with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my bag, and then sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees,
As long as they
and then
don't
I heard
use,
it.
like,
Someone
it's like
or
cheating.
something was walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away as to not give away that I was out of the tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. It sounded like it was something on two legs by the way its steps were placed. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my arms drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then from my right, I hear a sound of someone running through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot, hear who or whatever was there take off into the woods. There's no way I'm giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent in the darkness until daybreak. In the morning, I look around for a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some of the soft moist dirt not too far from our tent. It wasn't mine and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked me out as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was sulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point, we were already pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day, we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling that we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this, as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911 and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside our tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out something along the lines of, "We are armed, get out of here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, ready to go crazy on someone. Our stuff was scattered everywhere. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby and I walked to the edge, where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items and headed back on the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some time. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere and quite literally on our own. Since we hadn't seen any other hiker the entire time we had been out there, I really felt that we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me they were still following us for a while. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was someone just messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of hillbillies. I will never know because I will not be returning to find out. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland. Almost every house had acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I now am 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do
Ooh,
find
like a
myself missing this
combination of
setting in my old backyard every once in a while,
that.
but it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forest. This night, I was exploring said woods. I never went too far, usually up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened being out there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying. Faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined that there was a young girl that somehow wandered off too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help out, but then I worried that the girl would wander further and I wouldn't be able to hear her anymore. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to make sure that I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all this was how consistent the crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I had eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far before, and this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady footsteps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I had identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back and I didn't try to listen to see if the person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I really would be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked through them as discreetly as I could, to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but stayed at the window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadows. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest again. Despite a few creepy instances as a child, there has only been one time in my adult life that I truly felt primal fear. My apology if it's a little long, but trust I am being as concise as possible, and need to explain the surroundings a little at first. I live in a village in the middle of the English countryside. To paint an accurate picture of its size, it has a population of 4,000, but it feels more like 1,000 due to its spread out nature, and being surrounded on all sides by lots of fields. Farms and woods eventually connect to one pretty famous forest. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and because of this, it has notoriously bad phone and internet connections. Having lived here all my life, I know this place like the back of my hand. I know where all the public footpaths through the woods are, where they connect, which are shortcuts, where to cross deep streams, etc. I have gone on walks in this area throughout my childhood with my parents and alone as an adult. I felt safe here. This story takes place last summer in July after I moved home from university. As usual, this day both my parents got home at 5 p.m. We had dinner for a while longer than usual as my mom had quite a hectic day and was telling me about it. Because of this, I ended up heading out for my walk an hour
that
later than
Cersei work?
routine, around 7 p.m. But as it was summer, the sun was still shining, so honestly, I didn't really notice that it would start getting dark until I was out. The woodland closest to my house is less than 5 minutes away, and you enter through a gate into a farmer's field. You can see across the open area quite far until the first set of small woods obscures your view. That's where I was heading, as I knew this track takes under 2 hours and leads back to the same path I was standing on now. This entire area is very popular for dog walkers, so it's not unusual to see other people while you're out and about. And as this village, everybody says hello to everybody. I start walking. I'm just in my own world for a while until less than 100 feet before the entrance of the woods. An elderly man was coming out of them throwing a ball for his collie dog. As I got closer, I recognized it was John, who lived on the road next to mine and knew my grandpa. We stopped and I said hello as I patted his dog Max. While talking, I see another man coming out of the woods. No dog. Bright green jacket, very tall, and a good 10 years on me, age-wise. John and I chatter another minute and say goodbye. He warns me not to stay out there too long as it will be getting dark soon. True, the sky was bright pink and orange. The sun was indeed beginning to set. I hadn't really noticed. I continued down the path towards the man. When we were nearly passing each other, I look up to make brief eye contact, smile and say hello, like everyone here does, even if you don't recognize the person. My eyes instantly met his. He was already looking at me. His dark eyes locked on mine. He wasn't smiling. I didn't know him at all, but I knew something was wrong. It was in his eyes. I swallowed my politeness and looked to the ground as we passed. I had lived in my uni's city the past couple years, so I knew a red flag when I saw one, and my country bumpkin manners evaporated. I quickened my pace a little before entering the woods and shyly looked back. The guy was still walking in the same direction, following John. I felt relieved, starting to walk into the woods. It takes about 30 minutes to follow the path through the woods to the end. The pathway exit opened into another field that led to another set of woods. The sky was now a dark purple, the dimming light having been obscured to me by the trees. I was near the entrance of the second set of woods when I felt it. Fear. Complete crippling and absolute fear worked its way like electricity through me. I never felt anything like it before, or since, but I knew what it was. I whipped around. Standing at the exit of the first set of woods was the man. I could still make out his green jacket in the fading light. He's doubled back, and very quickly too. I had looked back several times while in those trees, and he hadn't been there. For a second I froze, as he did. He knew I'd seen him. To sprint the distance between us, it would take him about 5 minutes. He was obviously in good shape. I bolted into the woods. There was only one way I could go. I didn't care to look behind me. I sprinted for a couple of minutes before taking a sharp left turn off the path into the trees, hoping to throw him off a bit, but I couldn't see a thing. The light was already darkening and the trees made it 100 times worse, especially as I was now in the thick of them. Their branches catching my clothes like fingers, whipping and scratching my bare legs so badly. I ran and my lungs protested in pain, while my heart was beating like mad. I couldn't anymore. I got myself on the ground behind a big tree, my back against it, knees to my chest, hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing, desperately trying to pump air into my lungs for the next sprint. I listened for the first time. A few seconds pass silently. Then I hear him. Heavy footsteps snapping twigs behind me about 20 feet to my left. I dare not to look in case he sees me. I have my phone, but I know I have little chance of signal being where I was, and he'd either hear me talking or see the light from the display. I'm not ashamed to say at this point I started to cry, the tears falling silently down my cheeks.
What the hell?
I hear a deep voice exclaim.
Where are you? I know you're here. I saw you.
I have to clasp both my hands across my mouth to stop myself from making any noise. I can hear him moving around. I panic and find that I have the courage to slowly peek from behind the tree. He was about 10 feet behind me, less than 20 feet to my left, with his back to me. I moved back and my eyes search the surrounding area. I pick up a pretty heavy rock. I carefully check him again. His back still turned, but he's searching through the trees. Hunched down lower to the ground now. I make a snap decision, and with everything I had left in me, I threw the rock behind me to the right. It clattered through the branches of the trees and made one hell of a noise. I watched him immediately bolt in its direction, laughing. He laughed. I paused a little, hearing his footsteps get quieter, until I thought I wouldn't be so visible to him if I moved and threw myself forward. I ran, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but I was also aware that I was getting farther and farther away from home. I knew there had to be a stream somewhere close. If I found the stream, I can follow it as it borders the land and runs parallel to some of the footpaths. I ran until the trees finally cleared, and I can just make out another field through them on the other side. I thank God, and I push myself a little bit further till I'm out of the trees. The ground disappears from below my feet, and I go head over shoulders down the stream embankment. I crash into the water below. As I sputter it out, I feel both relieved to have found the stream and terrified that he's heard me. My phone is now ruined. I slowly make my way downstream as quiet as possible, listening for him the whole time as the stream borders the woods, looking up periodically just in case. After a while, maybe a half hour, I notice the trees begin to thin out and realize this is the edge of the woods where I would have been exiting and where my pathway connected to the original one I had started on. If I ran, I could get home in less than 20 minutes. As quiet as I could, I dragged myself on my stomach back up the embankment, army style, wanting to stay as low as possible. I peek over the top. I could just barely make out the opening of the woods exit path about 50 feet away. I sat and scanned the forest line for a couple of minutes, my eyes trying to make out movement despite it now being pitch black. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything either. I pushed myself up and sprinted as fast as I could across the field onto the pathway. I knew the gate that I'd entered through was in the adjoining field. It really wasn't far. I was so happy. I hear a screech from across the field. I swore my legs nearly gave out then and there. He had been waiting for me. I turned my head and saw him sprinting out of the woods at full pelt. I yelled and pushed myself further, tears coating my face. All I could do was run. I crossed into the main field now and I could see the moonlight shining off the metal gate. My house was just 5 minutes away after that. I have never focused on anything as much as that gate. He was faster than me and getting closer, yelling at me the whole time. I ran, pushing myself up and over the gate, and ran up the road. I dared look as I made the turn from my road. He was still following me. I raced up my driveway and threw myself into the door, running into the living room crying, yelling hysterically. My dad ran outside while my mom grabbed a hold of me as I collapsed, shaking. As it turns out, my parents had already called the police. As I said, I was going out for an hour or so at 7, and it was now past 12, and I hadn't answered when they had called my now broken phone. We called the police again to explain. They came and I gave a full statement. Both my parents and the police were surprised. Nothing like this happens here. There hasn't been a major reported crime in at least 100 years. But one look at me and it was obvious I was telling the truth. I was covered head to toe in marks, soaking wet and covered in mud. I won't go into how this experience changed me. It's depressing. But I will say the thing that scares me the most is that they never even had a suspect. Despite him following me so closely, he was gone by the time my dad ran outside. That guy is still out there, and who knows what he's really capable of. On a weekend in the fall, a friend asked me if I wanted to go camping.
I'm not saying it was hard.
I'm definitely not an outdoors person, nor do I enjoy being in the forest. I agreed though, because I felt bad since this friend had asked me before and I declined. As soon as I agreed, I immediately regretted it. I honestly don't even know where we were, but my friend drove for hours away from the town we were living in at the time. The forest was so thick it was literally what you see in scary movies. My friend told me I was being a wimp, but I got a weird vibe from the whole situation. We had arrived in the evening, so by the time we put up our tent, it was dark. "What is that?" I asked when I pointed to the number written on the tent. 4054. "I don't know, something that was there when we bought it," my friend said. I didn't think much of it, but I was still creeped out by the fact that we were literally in the middle of nowhere. I woke up, and I'm guessing it was around 3 in the morning, and I heard what sounded like someone making strange noises, almost animalistic. My friend sat up and looked at me. I was about to ask if he heard it too, when we heard branches snapping right behind the entrance of our tent. I could see someone's shadow right through it. They were crouched down, sitting right next to us. I guess I was thinking of calling the cops because I grabbed my phone, but there was no cell service. The person left and my friend and I were too scared to try to leave. Then we heard something else. The tent was being unzipped, but slowly. One zip at a time, like it was in slow motion. "Get out of here," my friend yelled, throwing something at the entrance. It actually worked and the person ran off. Again, the animalistic noises occurred at this point. Let's make a run for the car. I glanced out of the tent to see the car way in the distance, Windows smashed and tires popped. We're stuck, literally trapped. My friend was freaking out. We'll walk in the morning to try to get cell service. Then we'll call one of my other friends to come get us, I remember saying. The wait for morning seemed excruciating. We didn't sleep at all that night, and I kept hearing branches snap. Finally, at the first light, we quickly peeked out of the tent and decided to walk to get cell service. When we got outside the tent, I was scared. Where the tent said 5054, someone had crossed it out with red marker, then wrote underneath it, Tent 4054 is no more, with tons of exclamation points. My friend and I kept walking closer to get out of the forest and finally got cell service. When we finally had our friend come pick us up, we were telling him the entire story. See what they did to the car? As I pointed to the damage and ruined vehicle, I saw someone dramatically sit up. They had reclined the passenger seat, and when I looked, they were sitting perfectly upright as the seat rose up. They turned and looked out the window straight at us. A huge, animated smile was on the man's face. All of us were freaked out, and our friend drove away quickly. I still think of Tent 454 is no more. I don't want to know what that was supposed to mean.
Keeps getting farther. No.
In March of 2003, when I was 17, my brother and I took a weekend camping trip to the Los Padres National Forest. We had gone there many times with our family for day camping, swimming, and just lounging around. This time though, we went alone for a 2-night camping trip at our favorite spot that most locals simply called the Gorge. We will never forget this weekend for all the wrong reasons. We got there Saturday morning around 9 a.m. and hiked the 5 miles out to the Gorge. The Gorge is a large swimming hole with a huge 60-foot rock cliff boulder that visitors love to jump from into the deep water below. The jumping rock cliff is very steep, and one must jump in a specific location below to ensure they do not hit the rocks protruding from the wall face. The area has many primitive camping spots and is overall a beautiful yet isolated place. The first day was very fun, and after a long day of swimming, catching crawdads, jumping from rocks, and just relaxing, we set up our tent, made a fire, ate our cans of SpaghettiOs and a few crawdads we had cooked for dinner. Towards the end of dinner, we were visited by a large group of students who were camping further down the river. They stated they were students from the Bay Area who had a few nights left in their almost 2-week-long school camping trip. We offered them some chips and snacks and chatted a bit with them before they made their hike back to their camping spot. It soon got dark and my brother and I got ready for bed. My brother was 2 years younger than I and had a deep fear of isolation. So we slept in the same tent and agreed that we would keep the fire burning the entire night to ease his anxiety. We put 5 large logs onto the fire and crept inside our tent and got into our sleeping bags. We both fell asleep very fast as we were exhausted from the day. Around 2:30 in the morning, we were both awoken by a large splash of water near our tent that put out our fire. We heard no voices and could not see much from inside our tent. We froze in terror. My brother began to cry and I tried to calm him down. I told him that I would go outside to investigate and that everything would be okay. I told him that our water bladder must have fallen off the tree where we had hung it, and I'm sure it was some kind of coincidence. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped our tent, and stepped outside. I pointed the flashlight over the fire pit and saw 4 large men sitting around our fireplace staring at me, with what I can only describe as expressionless faces. It appears as though they had split open our 2-gallon water bladder that we had hung over the tree and had thrown it into the fire.
Oh, shoot.
I was in shock and I didn't know what to say. For about 5 seconds, none of them said anything. We just stared at each other. Then one of them said in a deep voice,
Get your friend out here.
Then I heard my brother hyperventilating and screaming in our tent in a way that made me feel helpless. I had no weapons and my brother and I were outnumbered 2 to 1. I asked the men what they wanted and told them that we could just leave and that we are sorry if we had taken their camping spot or invaded their area. They ignored my question and just stood up. That is when I saw 2 of the 4 men were holding something in their hands. Long swords shaped in appearance like a machete or a small sword, but they looked homemade and very primitive. The men yelled at us to get our asses up with them. I thought for a second they might be rangers getting mad at us for having too big of a fire, but once I glanced at their clothing and saw their baggy pants and their black and gray hoodie type clothing, I knew we were not that lucky. I had heard in the past that drug dealers or the Mexican cartel had been caught hiding large amounts of marijuana plants in the forest, and wondered if these people were some of the men who somehow felt that we were a threat to their crops. I was in fear of our lives. The men didn't directly touch us or threaten us with violence, but I definitely felt an implied threat in their tone and believed that we really had no choice in the matter. My brother, who was still crying, and I followed the lead male while the other 3 men fell back behind us. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and was visibly shaking. He then whispered to me that we were walking in the direction of the 60-foot rock cliff and that we needed to run. I was petrified and had not been paying attention to where they were leading us, but realized he was right. I stopped dead in my tracks and said to the men, "What are you going to do to us?" The lead male stated,
Nothing, but we're just gonna have some fun with you guys.
I felt that we really had no choice but to do what they said, and hoped that they were all merely screwing with us and that this would be all over soon. After about 30 seconds of walking, we arrived to the jumping spot on top of the boulder, overlooking the gorge swimming area. One of the men stated,
Have you guys ever jumped from here?
I told them that yes, I had, but my brother had not, since it was a pretty high jump and was very dangerous for most people due to the height and the rocks below. The men laughed again and called my brother a pussy. I told them that we were not, as I had jumped from the spot before, but that it was not safe to do in the dark. The men then formed a half circle around us, and one of the men said,
I wanna see. Show us that you are not a bunch of pussies.
I screamed at them that it was too dangerous at night, and during the day it was dangerous enough. I told them that there are many rocks that you have to avoid, and that if you did not jump correctly, it could kill you. I pleaded and pleaded. The men just laughed and took a few steps closer to us. I was beyond scared and could hear my heart beating through my ears. My brother at this point was crying loudly and saying things I could not understand. He was beyond terrified, and so was I. I grabbed his hand and told him we needed to get away from these men as we were in great danger. I told him that I had jumped off the rock boulder into the water before and knew where to jump, and that if he jumped with me, we would be okay. I told him I would use my flashlight to help guide us, and I would tell him where to put his feet and how far to jump. The men laughed at us as we had our conversation and showed zero humanity or pity. I grabbed my brother and placed his feet with my hand onto a specific place on the rock ledge where I remember jumping from last time I was there months before. I explained to him that I knew he was scared and so was I, but we needed to jump out as far as we can and slightly to the right, otherwise we would hit the rocks. He was shaking, crying, and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on the floor. The men laughed and kept saying they couldn't believe how scared we were. I then told my brother that we needed to jump now, and that it would be okay if he listened to me. I told him that after we jumped, we would swim to the shore on the right, and would hide in the bushes until daybreak, and would then go for help. I then grabbed his hand tightly and told him that when we hit the water, he needed to tuck his legs and arms in, so that they would not get hurt from the impact of the water, and instructed him that he needed to swim hard to the surface as we would sink pretty far down due to the height we were jumping from. I grabbed his hand and we jumped. I pulled him hard with me to ensure that we would be safe from the rocks below, and that he jumped far enough out. We fell for what seemed like a minute, but was only a few seconds in reality. My brother yelled all the way down in a way I have never heard from another human being before. Terror, dread, and fear of imminent death reverberated from his voice. I felt helpless and almost forgot where we were for those few seconds. Then we hit the water. As soon as we hit, I lost my grip on my brother's hand, but I did hear a second impact in the water. I swam towards the surface with all my energy and took a deep breath. I then listened for my brother to surface, but heard nothing. I panicked and dove into the water to try to grab him. Just as I dove, I felt his leg brush against my hand and realized that he was about to surface. I swam up again and heard my brother. He was crying and kept telling his arm hit the rock and he couldn't feel it anymore. The men above were laughing again and I heard one of them say,
They fucking made it, those idiots.
I then heard objects splashing in the water around us and realized they were throwing beer bottles or rocks or some other hard objects at us. I quickly grabbed my brother and helped him swim to the nearby shore. The whole time we swam, many objects landed dangerously close to us, and I felt that if any had hit us, it would have caused death or great bodily harm to us, especially if we were hit in the head. My flashlight had been lost in the fall and we were in complete darkness. We reached the water's edge and I pulled my brother to shore. Objects continued to rain down around us and we could hear the men yelling and laughing. I told my brother that we needed to run. He was crying and holding his injured arm that he could not feel or use it. It had a deep cut around the elbow, and even with just the starlight, we could see that this was a serious injury. We stumbled down the tree line and began making our way through the darkness to one of the main trails from past memory. We fell again and again and were cut by branches and rocks all over our bodies as we wandered about down the overgrown trail. Everything in my body told me to keep going and to get as far away from these men as we could. We walked for many minutes until we could no longer hear the men, and we waited. I wrapped my brother's arm with my shirt and told him that it was over and that all we had to do was wait until morning for help. We sat in that spot all night and my brother cried and shook for hours. I just put my arm around him and patted his head, as I did when we were children whenever he had a panic attack and our parents were not around. At daybreak we could finally see the severity of his injuries. He had a deep gash in his arm and his shoulder was obviously dislocated. I helped him hike up the nearby trail and we walked all the way back to the base camp ranger station. We explained what happened to the rangers and they sent 2 armed officers to go investigate the location. My brother was sent to a nearby hospital for treatment and I joined him on the ambulance ride over. The rangers and the police never found the men, but did retrieve most of our gear. The scary thing about this incident is that the same week, 2 teenage boys were found dead at the bottom of the gorge jumping area, and that their group had encountered the same people as we did at their camping location, with similar machete objects, who chased them off their camping spot. I am glad to be alive, and my brother and I have never gone camping alone again, or have never been back to that location. All that we have left from the incident are scars on my brother's arm, hospital bills, and a lot of trauma. An article of the death of the 2 teenage boys is below. I can only hope their deaths were accident as the authorities ruled. I did not find out about their deaths until 7 years after, but was horrified about the similar circumstances and timing of the 2 events. As to the men that forced us to jump that day, let's not meet again. Every summer, my family makes the trip from Texas to Vermont. 2 summers ago, my parents bought a new home, and for some reason, our house smelled really, really terrible. So, my mom went to the local candle and scent shop and ended up bonding with the woman who owned it. She convinced her to give me a summer job. The first month went smooth, with really only a few bad customers. One day, I was checking inventory in the back when I heard the bell above the door ring. I walked to the front of the store, calling out to whoever just entered, but no one replied to me or appeared to be in the store. So I just forgot about it and moved on with my day, blowing it off as the wind. That night, when I was getting into my car, I found a piece of notebook paper stuffed in the space between the slit of rubber in my window. It had my full name and a crudely drawn picture of a wedding ring. What the hell? I blew this off as my best friend and coworker, Courtney, trying to scare me like she always did. The next day at work, I told Courtney that she wasn't funny. She told me that she didn't do anything. Courtney always owns up to her pranks. After that, I was creeped out, but again dismissed it as another